I was having the worst panic attack of my life in the middle of our HOA meeting when Zeus, my German Shepherd service dog, did exactly what he'd been trained to do. He placed his massive paws on my chest and applied deep pressure therapy to bring my heart rate down. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I looked up to see HOA President Janet Crawford standing over us with a can of pepper spray. "Get that vicious animal away from people before someone gets hurt," she snarled, her finger hovering over the trigger. This is exactly why dangerous breeds don't belong in civilized communities. "He's not dangerous," I managed to whisper, my voice still shaky from the panic attack. "He's my medical alert service dog. He just saved me from—" "I don't care what kind of fake papers you bought online," Janet interrupted, now pointing the pepper spray directly at Zeus's face. "That animal violated the no pets policy the moment you brought it into this meeting. Security, remove them both." Around us, 43 neighbors sat in stunned silence as 2 security guards approached. Zeus remained perfectly still on my chest, his training overriding every natural instinct to defend himself as Janet waved chemical weapons at his face. That's when I realized this wasn't about pet policies or community rules. Janet Crawford was willing to assault a disabled veteran and his service dog in front of witnesses because she'd convinced herself that her authority trumped federal law. She was about to learn just how wrong she was, because Janet didn't know that I wasn't just any disabled veteran. I was a former military investigator with friends in very high places. And when you attack a service dog, you don't just violate HOA rules. You commit a federal crime. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I need you to understand what Zeus means to me before I tell you how I destroyed the people who tried to take him away. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a military police investigator, specializing in fraud and corruption cases. I was good at my job, really good. I had a talent for spotting patterns, following money trails, and building airtight cases against people who thought they were above the law. But war changes you in ways you don't expect. It wasn't the explosions or the gunfire that broke me. It was the constant hypervigilance, the inability to turn off that investigative instinct, the way my brain refused to stop scanning for threats even when I was safe at home. By my 3rd deployment, I was having panic attacks that would drop me to my knees in the middle of briefings. My heart would race so fast I thought it would explode. I'd break out in cold sweats during routine meetings. The doctors called it severe PTSD with panic disorder, but I called it a prison sentence. When I came home in 2019, the VA connected me with Zeus through their service dog program. He wasn't just a pet. He was a medical device wrapped in fur and loyalty. Zeus could detect the chemical changes in my body that preceded panic attacks, sometimes up to 20 minutes before I felt the first symptoms. When an attack was coming, he performed deep pressure therapy, place himself between me and crowds, or guide me to quiet spaces. He'd been trained by professional handlers for over 2 years and cost the VA program $35,000. More importantly, Zeus gave me my life back. With Zeus by my side, I could go grocery shopping without having a meltdown in the cereal aisle. I could attend my nephew's baseball games without scanning the crowd for threats. I could sleep through the night without jumping at every sound. When I decided to buy a house in Pine Valley Estates in 2022, Zeus was part of the decision. The neighborhood seemed perfect for both of us. Quiet streets for his daily walks, a dog park 2 blocks away, and neighbors who waved when we passed by. The HOA seemed reasonable enough. The covenants mentioned a no pets policy, but I dealt with this before. The Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act were crystal clear. Service dogs aren't pets, they're medical equipment, and no HOA can ban them. I submitted my service dog documentation during the home buying process, Zeus's training certificates, my VA medical records, and a letter from my psychiatrist explaining his role in my treatment. The real estate agent assured me it was all standard procedure. For 6 months, everything was perfect. Zeus and I fell into a comfortable routine. Morning walks through the neighborhood, afternoon training sessions in our fenced backyard, evening relaxation on our front porch. Neighbors would stop to chat. Kids would ask if they could pet Zeus with my permission. And several people mentioned how well-behaved and calm he was. Mrs. Rodriguez, next door, became especially fond of Zeus. Her husband was a veteran too, and she understood what service dogs meant to people like us. "That dog is an angel," she'd say, watching Zeus patiently wait while I fumbled with my keys during a mild anxiety episode. The problem started when Janet Crawford moved into the neighborhood. Janet had just retired from 30 years as a middle school principal, and she approached the HOA presidency like she was still dealing with 7th graders who needed strict discipline. Her first newsletter announced a return to order and promised rigorous enforcement of all community standards. I should have seen the warning signs, but I was too comfortable, too trusting. I'd forgotten the first rule of military investigations. People who crave power over others are usually hiding something themselves. Janet's campaign against Zeus began subtly. First came the anonymous complaints about excessive barking that were filed every Tuesday at exactly 9 a.m., even when Zeus and I were out of town visiting my sister. Then came the violation notices for unauthorized pet waste in common areas where Zeus had never been. I tried to handle it diplomatically. I invited Janet over to meet Zeus, to see his training credentials, to understand that he wasn't a pet but a medical necessity. She stood in my living room, watched Zeus perform his alert and response sequence, and said, "Very impressive, but rules are rules." "Janet," I explained, "federal law supersedes HOA covenants. Service dogs are protected under the ADA and Fair Housing Act. You literally cannot ban them." She smiled the cold smile of someone who'd spent decades wielding authority over people who couldn't fight back. "We'll see about that." That's when I realized Janet Crawford wasn't just ignorant about service dog laws. She was willfully defying them. And in my experience, people who openly break federal law are usually hiding bigger crimes. I just had to prove it. Escalation. Janet's harassment campaign escalated quickly from passive-aggressive to openly hostile. She installed security cameras positioned to monitor my front yard, claiming they were for community safety. She started following Zeus and me on our walks, staying exactly 15 feet behind us while taking photos and notes on her phone. The psychological warfare was textbook intimidation, and it was working. My panic attacks, which had been under control for over a year, started returning. Zeus was picking up on my increased anxiety and going into high alert mode more frequently. But Janet's biggest mistake was involving other neighbors in her campaign. She sent a letter to every household in Pine Valley Estates, claiming that aggressive dog breeds posed a threat to elderly residents and small children. The letter included photos of Zeus, taken with a telephoto lens from her surveillance cameras, and suggested that residents document any concerning behavior for HOA records. Mrs. Rodriguez brought me the letter with tears in her eyes. "Marcus, this is insane. Zeus is the gentlest dog I've ever met. What is wrong with this woman?" What was wrong, I was starting to suspect, was that Janet Crawford was used to absolute power and couldn't handle anyone who couldn't be bullied into submission. In her mind, my refusal to get rid of Zeus wasn't about medical necessity or federal law. It was a direct challenge to her authority. The situation reached a breaking point during the October HOA meeting. I attended specifically to address Janet's harassment campaign and to educate the board about service dog laws. I brought Zeus, as I always did when leaving home for extended periods, because my anxiety was spiking and I needed his support. That's when Janet made her biggest mistake yet. "Mr. Thompson," she announced as I entered the community center, "pets are not allowed at HOA meetings." "Zeus isn't a pet," I replied calmly, taking a seat in the back row. "He's a federally protected service animal, and I have every legal right to bring him anywhere I go." Janet's face flushed red. "I don't care what you call it. That animal is disruptive and potentially dangerous. I'm ordering you to remove it immediately." The room went silent. 43 neighbors were watching this confrontation, and I could see the confusion on their faces. Zeus was lying quietly at my feet, not making a sound, not bothering anyone. "Janet," I said, my military training keeping my voice steady, "you are violating federal law. The Americans with Disabilities Act specifically. Don't lecture me about the law." Janet exploded, her principal voice echoing off the walls. "I've run school boards and PDAs for 30 years. I know what real service dogs look like, and that's just an oversized pet with fake papers." That's when the panic attack hit. The combination of confrontation, public attention, and Janet's aggressive posturing triggered every PTSD response I developed over 3 combat deployments. My heart rate spiked, my vision tunneled, and I felt like I was drowning in my own body. Zeus responded instantly. He rose from his downstay position and placed his front paws on my chest, applying the deep pressure therapy that had saved me dozens of times before. His weight and warmth began to slow my racing heart, and his calm presence reminded my brain that I was safe. That's when Janet stood up with the pepper spray. "Get that vicious animal away from people before someone gets hurt," she shouted, pointing the canister at Zeus's face. What happened next was the most horrifying example of ignorance and cruelty I'd ever witnessed. Janet Crawford, a woman who'd spent 3 decades in education, was threatening to chemically assault a service dog who was performing life-saving medical treatment on a disabled veteran. "He's not attacking me." I managed to gasp out. "He's treating my panic attack. He's doing exactly what he was trained to do." But Janet was beyond reason. "I don't care what kind of fake papers you bought online," she snarled. "That animal violated the no pets policy the moment you brought it into this meeting. Security, remove them both." 2 security guards approached hesitantly. They could see that Zeus wasn't aggressive. He was still maintaining his position on my chest, completely ignoring Janet's threats while focusing on my medical needs. But they'd been hired by the HOA, and Janet was giving orders. "Ma'am," one guard said quietly, "maybe we should let the gentleman calm down first." "Remove them now," Janet screamed, waving the pepper spray. "I will not have dangerous animals threatening residents in our community center." That's when I realized Janet had crossed a line from which there was no return. She wasn't just violating my civil rights or breaking federal law. She was demonstrating a pattern of behavior that suggested deeper corruption and abuse of power. As a former military investigator, I recognized the signs. Janet's willingness to assault a disabled veteran and his service dog in front of witnesses showed someone who believed she was untouchable, someone who'd been getting away with illegal behavior for so long that she'd forgotten there were consequences. People like that always have bigger secrets. I just had to find them. "You know what, Janet?" I said, my breathing finally returning to normal as Zeus continued his therapy. "You're absolutely right. Rules are rules, and federal law is federal law. We'll see who wins when the FBI gets involved." Janet's confident expression faltered for just a moment, revealing something that looked like fear. That's when I knew I had her. The security guards helped me to my feet, and I walked out of that meeting with my head held high and Zeus trotting proudly beside me. Behind us, I could hear Janet trying to regain control of the room, but her voice sounded shaky now, uncertain. She just threatened a service dog with chemical weapons in front of 43 witnesses. In legal terms, that was assault, civil rights violation, and potentially a federal hate crime. But I suspected it was just a tip of the iceberg. That night, after Zeus and I were safely home, I did what any good investigator does when facing a corrupt official. I started digging. My first call was to my former commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Martinez, who now worked with the FBI's Civil Rights Division in Denver. I'd helped her with several fraud cases during my military service, and she owed me a favor. "Marcus," she said after I described the evening's events, "what happened to you and Zeus isn't just an HOA dispute. It's a federal civil rights violation. Threatening a service dog with pepper spray could be prosecuted as assault under disability rights law." "That's what I was hoping you'd say," I replied. "But Sarah, I think there's more here. Janet Crawford, showed the kind of arrogance that usually comes from getting away with bigger crimes. I want to run a full background check. Officially, I can't help you with that, Sarah said carefully. But if you happen to file a formal civil rights complaint, it would trigger an investigation that might uncover additional violations. The next morning, I filed complaints with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Each complaint included detailed documentation, photos of Janet's surveillance cameras, copies of her harassing letters, witness statements from neighbors, and security footage from the community center that showed her threatening Zeus with pepper spray. But that was just the beginning of my investigation. Using my old military contacts and investigative skills, I began building a comprehensive profile of Janet Crawford's background. What I found was disturbing. During her 30 years as a school principal, Janet had been the subject of multiple complaints for discrimination against disabled students. Parents had accused her of denying accommodations, isolating special needs children, and creating hostile environments for families seeking educational support. Most telling was a 2018 lawsuit filed by parents of an autistic child. They claimed Janet had banned the child's emotional support animal from school grounds, despite having proper medical documentation. The case had been settled quietly, with the school district paying $75,000 and Janet receiving additional training on disability rights law. She'd learned nothing from that experience except how to avoid paper trails. Digging deeper into Pine Valley Estate's financial records, I discovered Janet's true motivation for targeting me and Zeus. The HOA was planning a major development project, converting common areas into luxury amenities that would significantly increase property values and HOA fees. But the project required unanimous board approval and community support. Janet needed to project an image of strict control and enforcement to attract the kind of affluent residents who would support expensive upgrades. In her mind, a disabled veteran with a service dog didn't fit the upscale image she was trying to create. I wasn't just a rule breaker to Janet. I was a threat to her vision of Pine Valley Estates as an exclusive community for people without visible disabilities or support needs. The discrimination wasn't accidental. It was calculated. Armed with this evidence, I reached out to other residents who'd been targeted by Janet's enforcement campaigns. What I found was a pattern of selective harassment that focused on elderly residents, minorities, and anyone with visible signs of disability or economic struggle. Mrs. Chun, an elderly widow, had been fined repeatedly for excessive holiday decorations during Chinese New Year celebrations. The Martinez family had been cited for non-conforming vehicle colors when they parked their work truck in their own driveway. Mr. Patterson, who used a walker, had been threatened with violations for improperly maintained lawn areas that he couldn't reach due to mobility limitations. Janet had been systematically pushing out residents she deemed undesirable while enriching herself and her allies through selective enforcement and development schemes. But her biggest mistake was targeting a former military investigator with friends in federal law enforcement. The FBI investigation began 3 weeks after my complaint was filed, and Janet Crawford had no idea what was coming. Special Agent Rebecca Walsh specialized in civil rights violations and public corruption cases. When she arrived at Pine Valley Estates with a team of forensic accountants, Janet's confident facade began cracking. Immediately, Mrs. Crawford, Agent Walsh announced during an emergency HOA board meeting, "We're investigating complaints of civil rights violations, selective enforcement, and potential embezzlement of HOA funds." Janet tried to maintain her authoritarian composure, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "This is ridiculous," she blustered. "We run a clean organization focused on community standards." "Then you won't mind providing financial records, enforcement documentation, and correspondence files for the past 3 years," Walsh replied calmly. That's when Janet made her final, fatal mistake. "I don't have to provide anything without a warrant," she declared. "This is harassment of a volunteer, community leader." Agent Walsh smiled and produced a folded document from her briefcase. "Actually, you do. Here's your warrant. The forensic audit that followed was devastating. FBI accountants discovered that Janet had been embezzling HOA funds through fake vendor contracts, inflated service fees, and kickbacks from the development project she'd been planning. Over 3 years, she'd stolen nearly $180,000 from residents' dues while using selective enforcement to silence anyone who might question her financial management. But the civil rights violations were even more damning. Agent Walsh found evidence of systematic discrimination against disabled residents, minorities, and elderly homeowners. Janet's personal files contained notes describing residents as undesirable elements and strategies for encouraging voluntary relocation. The smoking gun was Janet's email correspondence with the development company. In dozens of messages, she explicitly discussed removing problematic residents to create a more upscale demographic that would support luxury amenities and higher fees. She'd been planning to use HOA harassment to conduct ethnic and disability cleansing of the entire neighborhood. When Agent Walsh confronted Janet with this evidence, her mask finally slipped completely. "You don't understand," Janet said, her voice desperate now. "I was trying to improve the community. Property values, quality of life. People like Thompson with his problems, they bring down the whole neighborhood." Agent Walsh looked at her with disgust. "Mrs. Crawford, you just confessed to federal civil rights violations on tape." The criminal charges came down like an avalanche: embezzlement, mail fraud, wire fraud, civil rights violations, conspiracy, and, because she threatened Zeus with pepper spray, assault under the Violence Against Service Animals Act. But the moment that gave me the most satisfaction came during Janet's perp walk. As FBI agents led her out of the community center in handcuffs, Zeus and I were sitting on a bench nearby. He was in his off-duty mode, just being a dog, enjoying the sunshine and watching the commotion with calm curiosity. Janet looked at us as she was placed in the federal vehicle, her face a mixture of rage and defeat. "This is all your fault," she hissed. "If you just followed the rules." "I did follow the rules," I replied quietly. "Federal rules. Constitutional rules. The kind that matter more than your personal prejudices." Agent Walsh approached as the car drove away. "Marcus, I want you to know, this investigation uncovered one of the most systematic patterns of HOA discrimination we've seen in Colorado. Your complaint prevented Janet from victimizing dozens of other residents." "What's going to happen to the HOA?" I asked. "Complete restructuring under federal oversight. New board, new policies, and mandatory civil rights. Training for all future leadership. Pine Valley Estates is going to become a model for inclusive community management." That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on my door with a bottle of wine and a huge smile. "Marcus, the whole neighborhood is talking about what you did. You didn't just save yourself and Zeus, you saved all of us." As we sat on my porch, watching Zeus play with her grandchildren, she asked the question I'd been wondering about myself. "How did you know she was stealing money?" I scratched Zeus behind the ears and smiled. "Same way Zeus knows when I'm about to have a panic attack. You learn to recognize the warning signs. People who abuse power in small ways usually abuse it in big ways too." Janet Crawford's trial became a federal case study in HOA corruption and civil rights violations. She was convicted on 17 counts and sentenced to 6 years in federal prison plus full restitution of the embezzled funds. More importantly, the Pine Valley Estates case led to new federal guidelines for HOA oversight and disability accommodation enforcement. The Justice Department now uses our story as a training example for civil rights investigators. But the real victory happened much quieter in the daily life of our transformed neighborhood. The new HOA board, elected by residents rather than appointed by Janet, implemented policies that prioritized inclusion and community support. They established a fund to help elderly and disabled residents maintain their homes, created accessible common areas, and banned discriminatory enforcement practices. Mrs. Chen's Chinese New Year decorations became an annual neighborhood celebration. The Martinez family's work truck became a symbol of the blue-collar families who were welcomed rather than harassed. Mr. Patterson received free lawn care through a new community assistance program. And Zeus, he became the unofficial neighborhood mascot. Kids learned about service dogs through educational programs Zeus and I started teaching. Elderly residents felt safer walking their dogs knowing Zeus and I were always nearby. Other veterans in the area reached out, creating an informal support network that grew into a formal PTSD assistance group. The most meaningful moment came 6 months after Janet's conviction, during the annual HOA meeting, the same community center where she'd threatened Zeus with pepper spray. This time, the meeting was packed with families, elderly residents, people of all backgrounds and abilities. The new board president, Mrs. Rodriguez, opened by reading a proclamation declaring Pine Valley Estates a service dog-friendly community. Zeus lay peacefully at my feet as neighbors took turns sharing stories of how the community had changed for the better. Children played quietly in the back while their parents participated in actual democratic governance. It felt like what neighborhoods were supposed to be, places where everyone belonged. During the open comment period, I stood to address the crowd. A year ago, I said, Janet Crawford told me that people like Zeus and me didn't belong in this community. She was wrong. Not because we had a legal right to be here, but because communities aren't about excluding people who are different. They're about including people who make us stronger. Zeus raised his head and looked around the room, taking in the sea of friendly faces. For a dog who'd been trained to detect threats and provide medical support, this must have felt like paradise, a place where his human was safe and surrounded by allies. Janet thought Zeus was dangerous because he was big and different and didn't fit her narrow vision of what belonged in suburbia. But the real danger was her willingness to hurt vulnerable people to maintain her power. I looked down at Zeus, who was now sitting at attention, his intelligent eyes watching me speak. Zeus taught me that strength isn't about dominating others, it's about protecting them. Community isn't about keeping people out, it's about bringing them in. And justice isn't about following rules blindly. It's about making sure the rules serve everyone equally. The applause was overwhelming, but what touched me most was seeing kids applaud right alongside their parents, learning that diversity and inclusion aren't just nice ideas, they're the foundation of healthy communities. After the meeting, as Zeus and I walked through our neighborhood under the streetlights, I thought about how much had changed in 1 year. Janet Crawford had tried to weaponize an HOA against vulnerable residents and ended up in federal prison. Her victims had become community leaders. Her reign of terror had transformed into a model of inclusive governance. Most importantly, Zeus and I were home, really home, in a place where service dogs weren't just tolerated but celebrated, where disabled veterans weren't excluded but embraced, where the rules protected everyone equally. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it requires federal intervention and criminal prosecutions. But sometimes all it takes is one person with a service dog and the courage to say no to a bully. Zeus looked up at me as we reached our front door, his tail wagging with simple contentment. He didn't understand federal law or civil rights violations or criminal prosecutions, but he understood that we were safe, we were home, and we were surrounded by people who cared about us. And really, that's all any of us need.